The year is 2020. We've all been living in a horrible pandemic, having to isolate ourselves from our family, our friends, our loved ones. But in that year, there was a glint of hope. As one of my favorite books of all time, Middle Game, gets nominated to win the Hugo Award for that year. But then July comes along and it loses to some book called A Memory Called Empire by Katie Martine, the first book in what has now become the Teixcalaan duology. So I asked myself, what is so special about this book that would dare to challenge my favorite book of all time? Well, I decided to see for myself what was so special about this book. And when I left it a little disappointed, well, I didn't give up. I decided, you know what, I'm going to request the sequel on NetGalley, and then I'll reread this one and read the second one again. And maybe then I'll be able to appreciate what so many people saw in this book enough to let it win the Hugo Award over Shauna Maguire's Middle Game. So, did it live up to my expectations? Did it really prove itself worthy of the Hugo Award? That's a question I don't know the answer to. What I will say is I definitely enjoyed the entire duology upon rereading the first one. So here's my review for both books, spoiler free. So allow me to start with some explanation. So I picked this up really wanting to see if it was as good as Middle Game. But that question of is it as good as Middle Game was a kind of an absurd question to ask because they're two very different books. This is a space opera. Middle Game is a urban fantasy or modern fantasy type thing, maybe a hint of sci-fi. And they were two very different audiences, I feel like, in a lot of ways. They did things very differently. And this book wasn't bad the first time that I read it. It was just very confusing. As an audiobook reader, for the most part, reading things like a space opera, where the world building is so dense, can be very confusing to someone like myself, which is really what prompted me to want to give it another shot, which is also why I requested the sequel from NetGalley in hopes that it would motivate me to revisit the series. But I knew I could not go into the second one without reading the first one. So much went over my head, which is why I was unable to really appreciate it. But from what I did gather, I was able to ascertain some of the hints at what people loved about it. And don't get me wrong, this series has a lot to show for it. And while it may not surpass Middle Game in my mind as the best book of 2020 or 2019, whatever it was, it's still a solid series, which is why I'm so excited to talk to you about what I think makes the series shine and why I think it might be worth exploring. So the Teixcalaan duology is centered around this one main empire called Teixcalaan. Essentially, it is a giant empire that's been built over the centuries to become this major political power where it basically has this one central planet and then it controls a number of different subplanets. Basically think of the planets almost like their own countries, or maybe the states within the bigger country. And the empire sort of controls everything. It's led by one emperor. Basically, it's more like a king and queen situation than it is democracy. And what we're following, though, isn't a member of Teixcalaan per se. Instead, it is an ambassador of a neighboring, I don't know if nation is the right word, but I'm going to use it for the sake of simplicity here. A neighboring nation who aren't exactly Teixcalaan, but they have to maintain relations so that there is some kind of cordial, so that chaos doesn't break out. The thing about Teixcalaan is that the reason they have so much power is that they're very colonial. They're very self-centered. They're very much of the idea that they are supreme because they are who they are, after all. That, I think, speaks to a lot of the major themes that are explored in this series, and part of what makes this series so strong is its ability to discuss those themes and really relate it to much of us as readers, as far as Westerners, whether we're from America or the UK. All these nations, or even Canada, all these nations are built on colonialism. The idea that we need to spread our intelligence, our morality, our supreme nature of being to other surrounding lands and help improve their lives, which is very much what Teixcalaan is all about. This ambassador who comes in, who has to maintain peace, is referred to as a barbarian, quite literally. She's seen as less intelligent, less civilized, less moral, and it's not her fault because she is, of course, not Teixcalaan. She is a barbarian. And that underlying theme is pervasive throughout the entire series. And I think it's part of what makes the dynamic between the ambassador and the people she has to interact with in this first book so strong. Because in the first book, we're following the ambassador herself, where she's basically being put into the situation as an ambassador, replacing the previous ambassador who has died, seemingly by some accidental food poisoning, but potentially something more sinister. And while she's doing that, she has to navigate the existing politics of her nation versus Teixcalaan, as well as the underlying problems or tension that surrounds the possibility that the previous ambassador may actually have been murdered. Which means, does that mean she is at risk? We don't know. We have to figure that out. She has to figure that out, and we're figuring it out through her eyes. And in doing so, we're really getting a better picture of Teixcalaan as a whole, and it's really just a way of the author sort of communicating those many, many flaws of the Teixcalaan Empire, which manages to be so advanced, both technologically and, I guess, politically. They have plenty of might and power, but it's built on so many flawed ways of thinking, as is most colonial worlds or Western nations, to be honest. Another aspect of what the ambassador has to deal with is just the cultural differences. Aside from the underlying bigotry that is targeted towards her, there was just the cultural differences about how people live their life. The common traits people do, the way they express themselves, and you don't want to commit a faux pas of some sort, just inadvertently, even if you will just be dismissed as barbarian, and of course that's to be accepted. But she has plenty of training to combat this. Of course, that can only take you so far. And what her biggest asset is, though, is that her people, her nation, has this piece of technology that basically allows you to implant the memories, and I guess in the simplest way to describe it is it's the mind of a previous person, a person who lived or maybe is still living, into your mind. In this case, it's supposed to be the mind of the previous ambassador. The complexities or the details of what exactly is that sort of piece of technology she's copying in there is a little deep, too deep to get into this review, best explored in the book. But at the core, it's this inner dialogue, this inner person you have to talk to, and they're there to help guide you and sort of help you acclimate to the system. But it's also a way of sort of carrying down memories and experience to new people in the society. But there are some problems with her device, which is one, it's out of date by over a decade and a half. That's because the previous ambassador hadn't updated it for 15 years, which itself, that fact, speaks to something going on beyond the existing political tensions because of the fact that he hadn't been home in so long. Like, why had he avoided his own home, for so long to update that? Why is it so out of date? And then two, the device that she has seems to have been sabotaged in some way or fashion, and she doesn't know how. And the thing is, though, even if he was targeted, the previous ambassador was targeted by the Teixcalaan people of some sort, it doesn't make sense that they could then target her because the Teixcalaan aren't supposed to know about this device. It's supposed to be a secret device that is confidential to her nation, to her people. So which implies that if it's not them, then is it one of her people? Which is a bigger conversation she has to reckon with. Big picture. The way this all comes together is almost like a mystery, but it's not quite a mystery. I'm not a big fan of mysteries myself. But there is a mystery there to sort of to understand what's all been going on, to basically get caught up to where the last ambassador was. And then, once she is caught up, to try and reckon with the many problems that were in place, I guess, for him before he died. While there is that journey, that exploration and discovery of what exactly is going on, I think a lot of that is just a way for Martine to give us a picture into what Teixcalaan is like, what the people are like, what the society is like, what the culture is like, and to speak to those larger themes. When the book finally gets to its climax, without giving away what that is, we essentially get introduced to a new conflict, which is now, aside from the tensions between her people and Teixcalaan, there seem to be these alien invaders who are not just a different type of human, they were entirely alien, different species, attacking the Teixcalaan people, attacking the outskirts. And that sort of puts a pin in any of the issues that may have been going on between the ambassador's people and the Teixcalaan people, because now the Teixcalaan have to put all their attention on combating this new alien threat. And that's where we leave off in the first book. The second book is largely focused on trying to deal with that conflict. All while doing so, it continues the reflection on the themes explored in the first book, on the notion that these Teixcalaan people are somehow advanced morally, ethically, what's the word, more intelligently, and challenging whether or not they are as civilized as they propose to be, and how they handle a conflict such as this. And while that is a central plot of the second book, and I feel like half of it is focused heavily on addressing that alien conflict. In the first half, though, it feels as if we're not necessarily wrapping up the plot points for the first book, but it's more like we're getting an extension onto where we left things off, which, to be fair, I felt like the first book left off at a pretty good place, despite this slight cliffhanger. It felt like it was a pretty good book on its own. It's a good standalone. But we see these underlying threads that were left expanded, in a way, and we get to see them sort of evolve into the new situation, which then puts our perspective into targeting the alien. One thing I should say is that the first book is focused entirely on the perspective of this ambassador. The second book breaks free of that view and instead gives us views of people from both the ambassador's home as well as Teixcalaan. So we're getting all these different perspectives of how they perceive and target the new threat and how they handle it. And so now it's less of a mystery about what the problem is, and it's more about the different ways people want to try and address this threat, and what it says about the Teixcalaan people, and whether or not they are in fact all they think they are, all as amazing as they think they are. Now, I hope I made it clear here that because we're breaking free of the ambassador, that means, is she in the second book? We won't really have to finish the first one to find out. But overall, I thought the second book did a really good job being its own thing while extending the threads of the first book and creating a more well-rounded world. Now, as far as how it transitions from the threads of the first book into the new conflict, I feel like I didn't quite believe some of the transitions that were made for some of our characters that we were first introduced in the first book and how they were sort of woven into the plot of the second book. I felt as if it didn't feel entirely natural. Like, I saw the way in which the author did it. It wasn't as if it would just happened like that. It was set up. I just didn't find it to be the most logical. Part of that, though, to be fair, could be that it's a complex book with a lot of threads going in different directions. So it's not that hard for me to just get confused again and mistake my own confusion for just a bad plot line. But that, I think, is one of the very few conflicts that I have with the book. Another conflict for the series or the book might be that as much as I found myself invested in the first book after rereading it or upon rereading it, by the time I was done with it, I felt myself kind of fatigued. I wasn't bored, but part of me didn't want to continue the series at that moment just because I had enough of it. Like, I didn't feel as if I wanted to keep going. And while I did keep going for the sake of wanting to put this review out and needing to finally get to this arc that I've had for so long, I won't lie, that feeling of tiredness never really went away. So as good as the series is, I'm not sure if it's necessarily built to be binged, which, to be fair, again, it's a dense series, has a lot to say, but I still say it's a problem with the book if I feel myself kind of bored with it. Not necessarily bored, but overwhelmed and wanting to move on from it in some ways. So overall, I gave the series 4 to 4.5 stars. I give both books the same rating. I think that reflects probably a very solid series, a very solid first and second book. I hope you give it a chance. If you read the first one and you liked it, I absolutely recommend the second one. I don't see you not liking it after the first one. But if you're thinking about whether or not you should read it, I would give it a shot. If you don't use space opera, it is a bit much, I think. But if you can just take a moment to try and acclimate to the new setting, to the new complex world, you might be able to figure it out. One thing that helped me was that in the first book, a lot of the Teixcalaan names start with a number, and it seems as if most of the characters were introduced to, at least the main characters, all have a different number. So if you think of their names as just a number, you're fine. The second book, I found us introduced to other people with the same number, different second name, whatever it was, and I found it more confusing, to be fair. But for the first book, you're probably good to go. And once you get past the first book, if you can follow along at that point, I think you'll be pretty much invested with the second one. So yes, give this a shot if you haven't. I know I'm a little behind, a little out of date with this review, but those are my thoughts. A solid series. I'm really glad I pushed myself to reread it. As uncomfortable as I was with the thought of what if I didn't like it, this is why I do this. This is why I request arcs. I know I might be kind of premature because it can encourage me to reflect on something I didn't quite love the first go around, and I think show that sometimes me not loving something isn't because it's not good or that I couldn't love it. In a different headspace, I think. So again, thanks so much for watching. If you made it to the end, why don't you give me Oh, I don't know. This is hard. Why don't you give me a flag? A flag of your nation, since we're talking about ambassadors and countries and whatnot. And as always, have a great day. Stay safe, and I'll see you all next time. Okay, goodbye.